I have been dead for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The Imperium simply has not told my body yet. The iron door sealed behind me with a sound like breaking bones, and I knew then that I would never again see the pale light of Tertius Prime's dying sun. The guards did not speak my crimes aloud. They no longer mattered. Heresy, sedition, failure to meet tithe obligations, speaking against a planetary governor's nephew who wore the uniform of the Astra Militarum like a costume at a masquerade. The charges blur together here because guilt and innocence exist only in the world above, in that distant realm where people still believe in justice and redemption. Here, in the bowels of Penitentia Maxima, there is only endurance. The intake chamber smelled of disinfectant and fear sweat, a combination that burned the nostrils and lingered at the back of the throat like a promise of sickness to come. Hundreds of us stood in lines that stretched beyond the reach of the flickering lumens, our shackles clinking in a rhythm that sounded almost like prayer beads being worked through desperate fingers. The man beside me, a thin merchant caught selling counterfeit devotional candles, wept silently as the servitors processed us one by one. His tears fell onto the stained concrete floor and vanished instantly, absorbed by stone that had drunk the moisture of 10,000 souls before him. The servitor that cataloged my existence had once been human. Its face was a patchwork of flesh and metal, one eye replaced by a crude optical scanner that whirred and clicked as it examined my features. The other eye, still organic, still human, watched me with something that might have been pity, if such emotions were permitted to survive the lobotomization process. It pressed cold metal fingers against my throat, recording my pulse, my temperature, and the subtle chemical signatures that would identify my corpse when the time came. Inmate 779588, it rasped in a voice like grinding gears. Classification? Political. Subclassification? Sedition. Minor. Estimated survival duration, 8 to 12 standard months. 8 to 12 months? They had calculated my death before I had even seen my cell. The uniform they gave me was brown, the color of dried blood or rusted iron. It hung loose on my frame, designed not for comfort, but for easy identification should I attempt escape. The fabric was rough against my skin, woven from reclaimed fibers that still carried the scent of whoever had worn it before me. I tried not to think about whether they had died in it, or simply outgrown the need for clothing altogether. My cell was a cube of reinforced rockcrete, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and just tall enough for me to stand without my head touching the ceiling, if I didn't straighten my shoulders completely. The walls wept condensation constantly, creating dark stains that resembled maps of worlds I would never see again. A narrow slot near the floor allowed the guards to slide in my daily ration of nutrient paste. Another slot at eye level permitted them to observe me at their leisure. There was no window, no source of natural light, only the harsh glare of a single lumen strip that never dimmed and never failed. The sleeping platform was a shelf of raw metal welded to the wall. No mattress, no pillow, no covering except the uniform on my back. The cold seeped through the fabric within minutes, settling into my bones like a parasite feeding on warmth and hope. I learned quickly that sleep was not rest in this place, but merely another form of survival, a temporary escape from consciousness that left me more exhausted than waking. The first night, I listened to the sounds of Penitentia Maxima breathing around me. The walls carried voices from distant cells, fragments of prayers, curses, and mad laughter echoing through the ventilation shafts like the whispers of the damned. Someone was screaming 3 levels below, a raw sound that went on until it became part of the ambient noise, no more remarkable than the humming of the power generators or the skittering of rats in the walls. I counted the seconds between the guard patrols, memorizing their rhythm like a litany. Every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the heavy tread of armored boots would pass my door, pause for exactly 7 seconds while they checked the observation slot, then continue down the corridor. The guards were not quite human anymore. Their bodies were augmented with crude bionics that allowed them to work longer shifts without rest. Their eyes had been replaced with sensors that could see in perfect darkness, and their voices carried the mechanical undertones of Voxcaster implants. They took pleasure in our misery, but it was a cold pleasure, surgical and efficient. They did not hate us personally, because that would have required them to see us as individuals rather than resources to be managed until depletion. We were inventory, nothing more. Inventory with an unfortunate tendency towards spoilage. The morning brought the first meal. If the gray paste that slid through the food slot could be called such a generous name. It tasted of nothing and everything, a carefully engineered blend of recycled protein and synthetic vitamins that would keep a human body functioning at minimal capacity for months or even years. I ate it with my fingers because no utensils were provided, licking the aluminum tray clean because I did not know when the next meal would come or if it would come at all. Later, I learned that the paste contained more than nutrients: mild sedatives to reduce aggression, mood stabilizers to prevent suicide attempts, and trace amounts of psychoactive compounds that made the mind more susceptible to suggestion and conditioning. The first few weeks of ingesting this chemical cocktail left me feeling disconnected from my own thoughts, as if I were watching someone else live my life through a sheet of dirty glass. The other inmates were shadows at first, glimpsed through the gaps in cell doors, or heard as disembodied voices in the darkness. The man in the cell to my left had been there for 6 years. He had been a clerk in the Planetary Defense Force, convicted of falsifying requisition reports to feed his family during a famine. His name was Marcus, and he talked constantly to keep madness at bay, telling me about his wife and children, who had probably forgotten his face by now. "The trick is to remember who you were," he would whisper through the thin wall between our cells. "Hold on to something, anything from before, a smell, a song, the way sunlight looked through your window. The moment you let go of that, you become what they want you to become." The woman across the corridor screamed in her sleep every night for the first month I was there. Her dreams were full of fire and burning children, the memories of a planet that had died while she watched from an orbital transport. She had been a refugee administrator, charged with corruption because she diverted supplies to save more lives than the official quotas allowed. Her crime was compassion, and her punishment was to relive the consequences of that compassion until she died. Labor began on my 5th day. They woke us before dawn, which meant nothing in a place where dawn was only a concept from another life, and marched us through corridors that stretched beyond the horizon of our understanding. Penitentia Maxima was not merely a prison, but an entire industrial complex built around the efficient extraction of labor from disposable human resources. The work was brutal, mindless, and designed to break both body and spirit through repetition and futility. My assignment was the Forge Works, a cavern of heat and smoke where we assembled components for weapons that would be used to conquer worlds we would never see. The temperature was maintained just below the threshold of what human flesh could endure. Hot enough to weaken us, but not hot enough to kill us quickly. The air was thick with metal particles and chemical vapors that burned the lungs and left a taste like copper pennies on the tongue. We worked in teams of 12, our movements choreographed by the rhythm of the production line and the ever-present threat of the shock prods carried by our supervisors. The components we assembled were simple things: trigger mechanisms for lass rifles, power couplings for vehicle engines, guidance chips for artillery shells. Each piece had to meet precise specifications, and failure to maintain quality standards resulted in immediate punishment. The punishments were creative in their cruelty. A worker whose hands shook too much from exhaustion might have those hands secured in metal braces that forced them to work in increasingly painful positions. Someone who fell behind the production pace would be fitted with stimulant injectors that kept them conscious and functional, even as their body began to shut down from fatigue. The supervisors took careful notes on which punishments were most effective at improving productivity, treating us as subjects in a grand experiment in human endurance. I learned to lose myself in the work, to let my mind drift away from my body while my hands continued their mechanical movements. This dissociation was survival, a way of preserving some small core of self, while the prison consumed everything else. But it came at a cost. Days blurred together into an endless present tense where past and future became abstract concepts. I began to forget the color of grass, the sound of rain, the feeling of wind that did not smell of industrial chemicals. The social dynamics of the prison were as complex as they were vicious. Alliances formed and dissolved based on the shifting currents of power and desperation. The strongest inmates, usually those with military backgrounds or criminal experience, established themselves as leaders of informal gangs that controlled the distribution of contraband and the assignment of cell blocks. They demanded tribute in the form of food rations, protection services, or sexual favors, and their enforcement methods were brutal and immediate. I aligned myself with a group led by a former sergeant named Kane, a man whose body was a catalog of scars from a dozen different battlefields. He had been convicted of abandoning his post during a chaos cult uprising, though he claimed he had been saving civilians when his commanding officer branded him a coward. Kane understood the value of discipline and organization. Under his protection, I learned the unwritten rules that governed life in Penitentia Maxima. Never show weakness, because weakness was blood in the water, and the predators here were always hungry. Never volunteer for anything, because volunteers were the first to die in whatever new horror the guards had devised. Never trust anyone completely, because betrayal was sometimes the only currency that could buy survival. Never give up hope, because hope was the only thing that separated the living from the walking dead, even if that hope was nothing more than the possibility of dying quickly instead of slowly. The guards encouraged conflict between inmates because fighting prisoners were easier to control than organized ones. They would deliberately create situations where we were forced to compete for resources or privileges, then step back and watch us tear each other apart with the detached curiosity of scientists observing laboratory animals. The winners of these conflicts received small rewards, extra food, better cell assignments, but the victories were always temporary and the costs were always permanent. I killed my first man on a Tuesday, or what I had decided to call Tuesday, in the timeless hell of our underground world. His name was Singh, a tax collector before his arrest for skimming from the Imperial tithe. He was small and quick, with the cunning of a man who had spent his life taking what belonged to others. For weeks, he had been stealing from my food rations, just enough that I felt constant hunger, but not so much that I noticed immediately. When I finally caught him, he laughed and told me I was too weak to do anything about it. He was wrong. The beating I gave him was not born of passion or rage, but methodical calculation, targeting joints and soft tissue where the evidence of violence would be less visible, techniques I had learned by watching other inmates. When Singh finally stopped moving, I felt nothing but a faint satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The guards found his body during the next inspection. They recorded his death as natural causes, heart failure from poor nutrition and stress. No one questioned it. Questioning required paperwork, and paperwork served no purpose. Singh vanished from the manifest as though he had never existed, and another prisoner was assigned to his cell within hours. That night, Kane nodded to me with something that might have been approval. "You're learning," he said. "The first kill is always the hardest. After that, it's just another skill, like welding or reading or anything else you need to survive." He was right. The second death came easier. The third, easier still. By the end of my first year in Penitentia Maxima, I had stopped counting. Violence had become routine, no more remarkable than eating, sleeping, or working the production lines. My imagination, once limited by horror, expanded to accommodate realities I could never have conceived in my previous life. But physical violence was only the most visible way the prison consumed us. The true destruction came slowly, the erosion of everything that made us human. They fed us just enough to function, but never enough to feel full. They allowed just enough sleep to prevent collapse, but never enough to feel rested. They gave just enough medical care to prevent epidemics, but never enough to erase suffering. Psychological warfare was more refined. Sometimes they announced that certain prisoners were being considered for early release, sparking desperate competitions to prove worth through obedience or productivity. It was always a lie. No one left Penitentia Maxima except in a body bag, or as a servitor. The servitor program was the cruelest deception of all. Prisoners were told that their consciousness would be preserved, that they would live on as valuable servants of the Imperium. The truth was lobotomization and cybernetic implantation, stripping away all but the barest brain function to operate machinery. The servitors that maintained the prison had once been men and women like us. Their humanity had been surgically erased and replaced with mechanical obedience. I watched friends disappear into the conversion chambers, convinced they were choosing survival over death. Marcus, the clerk, who had once taught me the rules of survival, volunteered after learning that his family had died in a mining accident. He could no longer endure the thought that his suffering had no purpose. The promise of mechanical peace was more bearable than conscious despair. The last time I saw him, he was sweeping the corridor outside my cell. His movements were precise and robotic. His eyes had been replaced with cold optical sensors, his skull marked with scars where his personality had been cut away. I called his name. He did not respond. Marcus was gone. Only the shell remained. The seasons changed above us, though we knew of them only through subtle variations in temperature and humidity that seeped down through the ventilation systems. Summer brought suffocating heat that made already lethal labor nearly unbearable. Winter brought a chill that froze marrow and turned every breath into mist. Years passed, or what felt like years. Time became elastic in that endless twilight, stretching and collapsing according to the rhythms of pain and brief relief. I forgot my age, whether I was 30, 50, or something in between. My hair went gray, then white, then fell out in clumps from the chemicals in the factories. My teeth loosened and fell, leaving gaps that made eating and speaking difficult. The woman who screamed in her sleep died during my third winter. I heard her final breath through the wall, a rattling exhalation that lingered before fading into silence. Her body was left in the cell for 2 days before the guards finally dragged it away, leaving the entire block thick with the stench of decay. New prisoners always came, filling the gaps left by the dead, the converted, or the disappeared. They arrived wide-eyed, speaking of appeals, justice, and outside contact. The older inmates watched them with pity, knowing they would either adapt or die, and that even if they survived, they would never again be the people they once were. I tried to help some of them, sharing what I had learned. Many ignored my advice, believing their innocence or status would shield them. A few learned quickly enough to survive their first year. Many did not. The gladiatorial combats began in my 4th year, though the guards called them disciplinary exhibitions in their reports. Inmates who broke rules or failed quotas were forced into fights inside a makeshift arena built in a storage chamber. The fights were not to the death officially, but serious injuries were common, and medical care was scarce. The guards watched from raised platforms, betting on outcomes, critiquing techniques with the dispassion of farmers discussing livestock. I was chosen after striking a guard. He had been taunting a dying man in the cell beside mine, describing how his family had been sold into servitude to pay debts. His cruelty was deliberate, designed to break a spirit already near death. When he turned his attention to me, speculating what services my body might provide when I was too weak to work, I snapped. The blow was instinctive, years of suppressed rage behind it. My fist crushed his throat. He survived, but his voice was replaced with mechanical rasp, a permanent reminder of what defiance could accomplish. My opponent in the arena was Voss, a massive ex-pit fighter, imprisoned for killing a governor's son in an unsanctioned bout. He was everything I wasn't: young, strong, fearless. The guards cheered his entrance like ravenous beasts. The weapons were crude: rebar, chains, jagged bottles wrapped in cloth. I chose a length of pipe, heavy enough to break bone, but light enough to maneuver. Voss chose a chain, testing its weight like a professional executioner. The fight lasted 17 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Voss was faster, stronger, more skilled. But I had something he didn't: desperation, cunning, and years of rage forged in captivity. I avoided his strikes, using his arrogance against him. When the moment came, I stepped into his guard, slamming the pipe into his solar plexus with enough force to rupture organs. He folded, choking on blood. I struck his skull, and he collapsed into silence. The guards cheered my victory, but their applause felt like condemnation. I had become what they wanted: a killer who fought for their amusement, a broken thing that had forgotten the difference between survival and surrender. They returned me to my cell with looks of satisfaction, as if I had passed some crucial test. Victories became easier, but the weight heavier. Each opponent was another prisoner, another soul devoured by the same system. I killed them quickly, efficiently, without hate, because in Penitentia Maxima, caring was the fastest path to death. Between fights, I worked the production lines and tried to remember who I had been before becoming a gladiator. The memories were fading, becoming abstract and uncertain, like stories someone had told me about people I had never met. Had I really been a teacher once, standing in front of classrooms full of children who looked at me with respect and affection? Had I really lived in a small house with a garden, where I grew vegetables and flowers for no reason other than finding beauty in growing things? The details blurred together until I could no longer be certain what was memory and what was imagination. Perhaps I had never been anything except what I was now: a prisoner, a killer, a broken thing that existed only to serve as an example of what happens to those who oppose the Imperium's will. Maybe my former life was nothing more than a comforting lie, invented to make this present existence bearable. Cain died during my 5th year, not from violence, but from a cancer that had been growing in his lungs for months. The chemicals in the air had finally poisoned his body beyond repair. He faced death with the same steady pragmatism he had brought to everything else, offering me lessons about leadership and survival until his voice grew too weak to carry across the cell. "Don't let them make you into something you can't live with," he told me in our final conversation. "I've seen good men become monsters in here, and monsters who found ways to stay human. The choice is always yours, even when it doesn't feel like there's a choice at all." His death left a vacuum in the prison's power structure, one that others immediately fought to fill. Leadership contests were swift and brutal, decided through betrayal and assassination rather than order or consensus. I stayed away from these struggles. By then, I had learned that survival came from remaining valuable enough to protect, but never important enough to threaten. The new leader was Catherine, a former naval officer convicted of mutiny after refusing orders to bombard a civilian population. Intelligent, ruthless, and utterly committed to survival, she reshaped the prison's hierarchy into something efficient, but far more brutal. Punishments under her rule were harsh, and mercy no longer existed. After one of my arena victories, Catherine studied me with cold eyes that had forgotten compassion. "You fight well," she said, "but you fight like someone who still believes he's leaving this place. That's going to get you killed." She was right. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me was still clinging to the illusion of freedom, redemption, or release. That hope was a weakness, and weaknesses in Penitentia Maxima always became fatal. The escape attempt came during my 6th year. A group of political prisoners had bribed guards and obtained maps of the facility. They invited me to join, knowing my combat experience gave them a better chance. Their plan was detailed but flawed. Create a distraction, overwhelm the guards at a secondary checkpoint, and use maintenance tunnels to reach the surface. I agreed, though I knew escape was never truly possible. The real prison wasn't the walls, it was what the years inside had done to us. We carried the cages in our minds and souls, and no door could free us from that. The attempt failed, not because of the plan, but because betrayal is always cheaper than loyalty. The guards had known from the start. A prisoner named Peter, desperate to survive another winter, sold us out for better treatment. They allowed the plan to unfold until we were fully committed, then sealed the tunnels and released hunting teams to track us down like vermin. The pursuit was deliberate and cruel. Gas flushed us from hiding. Shock prods dropped those who resisted, and casual beatings discouraged future dreams of freedom. Out of 12 who attempted escape, 4 were killed instantly, 3 were sent for servitor conversion, and the rest, including me, were dragged back into the population under heavier restrictions. My punishment was solitary confinement. The cell was barely large enough to lie down. No light, except what leaked through the crack. Under the door. No sound but my own breath. No human contact except for the food shoved inside once a day. Solitary confinement wasn't survival. It was erosion, a slow destruction of the mind. I talked to myself endlessly, holding conversations with ghosts from my past, reciting poems I only half remembered, singing broken songs that belonged to another life. Soon I answered voices that didn't exist, shadows in the dark that grew substance when I wasn't looking directly at them. I knew they were hallucinations, but knowing didn't make them less real. When I finally returned to general population, everything had changed. Conditions were harsher, punishments crueler, and deaths more frequent. The arena had become a full-scale tournament, complete with brackets, championships, and betting pools. Guards and administrators placed wagers on which of us would live and which would die. My reputation as a fighter had only grown, and I was chosen as one of the championship contenders. The other prisoners looked at me with a mixture of fear, respect, and pity. They knew, as I was beginning to understand, that being good at killing wasn't survival. It was a curse. My first opponent was a young man named David, barely 20 years old, convicted of draft evasion. He hadn't yet learned how to fight, relying on raw desperation. I killed him quickly, without passion, without thought. The crowd cheered, but their noise felt distant, meaningless. Solitary confinement had burned away the emotions that once made violence difficult. Match after match blurred together. Opponents came, desperate and doomed, and I dispatched them with the cold efficiency of a machine. The crowds grew louder, but inside me there was only silence. The final match was against Catherine herself, the naval officer turned leader. She was ruthless, hardened, and had nothing left to lose. One of us walks away, she told me. The other becomes fertilizer for the prison graveyard. But either way, we're already dead. We died the day we walked through those doors. Everything since has just been the body learning to catch up. She was right. The fight was brutal, lasting longer than any before it. In the end, I killed her not with superior skill, but through deception. I feigned an injury, luring her into lowering her guard just long enough for a killing blow. The strike caught her in the temple, crushing the bone and driving fragments into her brain. She fell without a sound. her face showing no surprise, no accusation, only the distant expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. The crowd erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the concrete walls like the screaming of the damned. I stood over Catherine's body, covered in her blood and my own, feeling absolutely nothing. The tournament was over. The championship was mine. And yet, none of it mattered, because we had all been dead from the very beginning. That night, they returned me to my cell with promises of rewards and improved conditions, lies I had long since learned to recognize. The tournament's true purpose had been served: entertainment for the guards, and a grim reminder to the other prisoners of what happened to those who grew too skilled at violence. From then on, my life became a cycle. I would fight when called upon, kill whoever they placed in front of me, until one day I grew too old or too broken to be useful. And then I would be quietly disposed of. The years blurred together into an indistinguishable haze of routine violence and grinding despair. I fought in the arena when summoned, worked the production lines when assigned, and rotted in my cell in the hours between obligations. The other prisoners kept their distance. They saw what I had become: something dangerous, something broken. New inmates arrived constantly, replacing the dead, the disappeared, and the converted. I watched them follow the same path I had walked, but I felt no connection to their suffering. Their survival, or their death, meant nothing. Even survival itself had lost its meaning. When sleep came, my dreams were not of freedom, revenge, or justice. They were of non-existence. I dreamed of dissolving into the stone and steel of my cell, of forgetting my name, my history, my face. I dreamed of peace, the kind that only comes when consciousness stops, when the burden of identity finally falls away. But consciousness clung to me, dragging me through the same routine day after day. My body endured, despite malnutrition, chemical exposure, and endless violence. My mind still processed experiences, though they all blurred together into forgettable repetitions. Time no longer existed in days or years. I measured it in deaths: the death of opponents in the arena, the death of cellmates from disease or exhaustion, the death of parts of myself I had once thought essential. Each death marked the steady transformation from a man into something else, something shaped like a human, but stripped of all human purpose. Sometimes administrators visited, studying me like a successful experiment. They asked about my experiences, my observations, my suggestions for improving efficiency. I answered truthfully, not because I cared, but because honesty required less effort than lies. "You've adapted remarkably well," one of them told me during a long interview. "Most prisoners either break completely or resist until they're useless. You found the perfect balance: compliant, yet functional." I asked what he meant, though I already knew. His reply was simple: "You've become exactly what the system was designed to produce: a human stripped of resistance, yet capable of serving its needs. You are the future of Imperial corrections." He was proud of their creation, proud of what they had broken me into, their masterpiece. That night, I lay on the cold metal slab that served as my bed and tried to remember my old face, the man I once was. But what surfaced was vague, generic, almost imaginary. I could not recall the color of my eyes, the shape of my smile, or even the way my voice once sounded. The man I used to be was gone, replaced by something that only resembled him in form. The final revelation came in my 10th year inside Penitentia Maxima. By then, time had lost all meaning, but I remember the change. A new administrator arrived, Elena Vasquez, young, fresh, unhardened. She still looked at prisoners as human beings. She brought reforms, better food, medical care, education programs, and the idea of rehabilitation. For the first time in years, I felt something like hope stir within me. Maybe I wasn't completely gone. Maybe the human part of me was only dormant, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. When it was my turn to meet her, I sat across from her in an office decorated with plants and photographs of green fields and children playing. The sight of those pictures was almost painful after so many years of steel and concrete. She read through my file. 10 years, 4 months, 17 days, she said softly. That's an unusually long time for someone in your classification. She called it service as though my imprisonment had been a kind of employment. She asked what I would do if I were released. Her sincerity was dangerous. It tempted me to hope. But hope was a weakness. I told her the truth. I could no longer want anything beyond survival. She made notes, her face reflecting genuine concern. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, she said, but it's not irreversible. With support, even the deepest wounds can heal. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the man she wanted to rehabilitate no longer existed. But I said nothing, because her hope mattered more to her than the truth. For 8 months, she brought change. Classes, literacy programs, teachers like Samuel, the former librarian who told us, reading is remembering how to be human. Every word you understand is a piece of yourself that the system hasn't destroyed yet. 3 weeks later, he was murdered over a food ration. His death extinguished more than just a life. It killed the fragile spark his words had ignited. Elena Vasquez lasted less than a year. Officially, she was reassigned due to budget constraints. The truth was simpler. Compassion is expensive, and the Imperium had no use for expensive ideals. Her replacement was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man forged by war, a butcher who saw prisoners not as people, but as enemies to be managed. He stripped away her reforms overnight. Food was cut. Medical care became bare survival. Education vanished, and the gladiatorial tournaments returned, more brutal and frequent than ever. Rehabilitation is a luxury we cannot afford, he declared. Your purpose is labor until you are no longer useful. Accept this, and your time will be tolerable. Resist, and it will not. And so, the cycle resumed. The old system returned in full, but something had changed during that brief taste of reform, something that could never fully be undone. Some prisoners still remembered what it felt like to be treated as human beings rather than resources. That memory alone became a kind of resistance, more dangerous than any physical rebellion. Quietly, they began to organize, sharing scraps of information and resources, hinting at coordinated action. I was approached more than once. Groups sought me out, some planning escape, others sabotage or open protest. My reputation as an arena fighter made me valuable for violent resistance, while my years of captivity gave me knowledge of prison operations that could serve subtler schemes. I declined every offer. I understood that organized rebellion only gave the administration excuses for harsher measures. The crackdown began 3 months after Colonel Thorne's arrival, triggered by the discovery of a smuggling network that had been moving contraband between cell blocks. The investigation was swift and brutal. Interrogations, beatings and punishments designed not only to extract information, but to destroy solidarity. Prisoners betrayed one another in exchange for promises of improved treatment, or out of fear of worse suffering. Suspicion poisoned every cell block. Trust itself became dangerous. I was questioned repeatedly about what I knew of resistance, about my relationships with others, about whether I would serve as an informant in exchange for privileges. The interrogators were experts. They understood the psychology of long-term prisoners, knew exactly which pressures broke solidarity and which stripped away the last threads of dignity. "You're a survivor," the lead interrogator told me during our final session. "You've lasted 10 years by adapting to conditions and avoiding unnecessary risks. Cooperation is simply the logical next step." He was offering me a choice: collaboration or resistance. But both paths led to the same place. Collaborators became disposable the moment they ceased being useful. Resistors were simply disposed of sooner. I chose a third way: total withdrawal. No meetings, no whispers, no alliances. I worked when assigned, fought when summoned, and otherwise kept silent in my cell, like a machine powered down between operations. It kept me invisible, but it cost me everything. The other prisoners avoided me. Some thought I was an informant. Others thought I'd gone mad. I became a ghost, present but absent, alive but not living. In time, the resistance network was crushed, undone by investigation and betrayal. Its members were executed or transferred to darker places. The administration celebrated their triumph with even harsher restrictions, stricter surveillance, and near total isolation. Then Colonel Thorne summoned me. He studied me with the cold intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle. 43 prisoners, he said, reading from his report. 43 involved in resistance. And yet, you were not among them, despite your skill, despite your reputation. Why? I gave no answer. Silence was safer than truth. "Intelligence suggests," he continued, "that you are either the smartest prisoner here or the most broken. Either way, you're useful. You'll be transferred to the research wing for extended observation and testing." The research wing lay deep beneath Penitentia Maxima, beyond multiple checkpoints, in chambers where the light never reached naturally. The prisoners there were test subjects in ongoing experiments, volunteers promised better conditions, or simply chosen for traits the researchers found interesting. My new cell was larger, better lit, climate-controlled, and even had a small window overlooking the caverns where the prison's waste and power systems thundered without rest. The comforts weren't kindness, they were necessities. Research subjects needed to be preserved for study. The testing began immediately. Teams of specialists measured my reflexes, cognitive capacity, stress responses, and pain thresholds. They cataloged the scars of a decade in captivity: lungs damaged by chemical air, bones thinned by poor nutrition, a nervous system permanently wired to hypervigilance like a battlefield veteran. The psychological tests were worse. They measured empathy, morality, and emotional response. They studied my ability to kill without hesitation, to choose survival over compassion. "Fascinating," one researcher muttered while reviewing results. "A complete erosion of conventional morality, but not psychopathy, not antisocial personality, merely a replacement. Survival ethics in place of social ethics." I had become their specimen, proof that the system worked, evidence that any man could be dismantled and rebuilt into something institutionally useful. Other test subjects moved along the same spectrum. Some resisted, clinging to scraps of self. Others had already adapted into mechanical compliance. A few had gone beyond even me, biological machines responding to commands without thought or will. Dr. Helena Cross was my lead researcher, thin, gray-haired, with the intensity of someone whose work had consumed her soul. She explained their mission during one of our interviews. The traditional model of incarceration relies on punishment, she said, reviewing notes. But punishment is inefficient. It requires endless surveillance, endless enforcement. What we're creating here is more elegant. Subjects who internalize institutional goals so completely that external control becomes unnecessary. Perfect prisoners, human beings remade into loyal tools. You, she told me, are our most successful subject. 10 years of conditioning have produced an individual who functions optimally in institutional parameters while retaining cognitive capacity for complex tasks. You are the template for the future of imperial justice. I asked her what would happen when the research was complete, when my usefulness ended. That depends on our final evaluations, she replied. Some subjects will be transferred to productive work programs. Others will undergo advanced modification. I knew what that meant. Servitor conversion. The surgical removal of everything human, leaving only obedience. The research went on for months. Every day brought new experiments, chemical treatments, surgical procedures, behavioral therapies designed to reshape thought itself. I submitted willingly. Resistance would have been pointless. The results showed exactly what they wanted. My independence faded. My emotions dulled. My thought patterns aligned more closely with institutional expectations. I was being fine-tuned into their vision of perfection. Dr. Cross seemed pleased. During our final session, she spoke with calm satisfaction. The techniques we've developed here will revolutionize imperial corrections. No longer will criminals be warehoused to die. Instead, they'll be reshaped into loyal servants of the Imperium. Efficient, productive, useful. Then she asked me if I had any questions about the research, about my role in it. I asked her whether she thought the man who had entered Penitentia Maxima 10 years ago would even recognize the thing I had become. Probably not, she said after considering the question. But that person was a criminal who threatened imperial stability through seditious behavior. The individual sitting in front of me now was a loyal subject who understood his proper role in the social order. The transformation represented an improvement by any reasonable standard. She was right from her perspective. The man who had been arrested for speaking against corruption had been replaced by something more useful and less troublesome. The process had been efficient, thorough, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. I was a testament to the effectiveness of imperial justice, proof that rehabilitation was possible if one defined rehabilitation as the complete erasure of undesirable characteristics. The notification of my transfer came 3 days later, delivered by guards who treated me with the mechanical courtesy reserved for valuable equipment being moved between departments. I was being reassigned to a work program on an agri-world, where my skills and conditioning would be utilized for food production activities essential to imperial supply chains. The transport ship was filled with other graduates of various correctional research programs. Individuals who had been modified in different ways, but shared the common characteristic of complete institutional compliance. We sat in silence during the journey, each of us lost in whatever remained of our individual consciousness, no longer capable of the kind of communication that might have provided comfort or companionship. The agri-world was called Demet's Garden, a name that suggested abundance and natural beauty, but described a landscape stripped of everything except its capacity to produce food for distant populations. The soil was exhausted from generations of intensive farming. The water was contaminated with agricultural chemicals, and the air carried the dusty smell of a world that had forgotten how to sustain life without constant artificial intervention. The work camps were scattered across the planetary surface, each focused on a different aspect of food production: grain cultivation, protein synthesis, nutrient extraction from organic waste. The workers were a mixture of indentured servants, penal colonists, and research subjects like myself, all modified in various ways to maximize productivity and minimize maintenance requirements. I was assigned to Camp 17, a facility that specialized in the cultivation of protein-rich algae and vast artificial lakes that stretched beyond the horizon. The work was repetitive and exhausting, involving the maintenance of complex filtration systems that kept the algae populations healthy while extracting the nutrients that would eventually become processed food for Imperial citizens on more fortunate worlds. The other workers were mostly silent, their personalities erased or suppressed to the point where conversation was neither possible nor necessary. We worked according to schedules programmed into implants that regulated our sleep cycles, nutrition intake, and labor output with mechanical precision. The camp administrators were few in number because extensive supervision was unnecessary when the workers had been conditioned to police themselves. Days blurred into months, and months into years as we performed our assigned functions with the reliability of biological machinery. I maintained the filtration systems, harvested the algae, and processed the nutrients according to protocols burned into my memory through repetition and reinforcement. The work was my existence, and existence was the work, a perfect closed loop that required no external motivation or reward. Sometimes, in the brief moments between sleep and waking, I would remember fragments of dreams that seemed to come from someone else's life. Images of sunlight falling through windows onto wooden floors, the sound of children laughing, the taste of food that had been prepared with care rather than engineered for efficiency. These memories felt like messages from a ghost, communications from someone who had died so long ago that even his name had been forgotten. But the dreams always faded, dissolved by the harsh light of morning and the immediate requirements of another day's labor. The person who had experienced those moments of joy and connection was as distant from my current reality as the Emperor himself, a figure from history whose existence could be acknowledged but not meaningfully comprehended. The years passed, marked only by the subtle changes in my aging body and the gradual deterioration of the equipment I maintained. My hair became completely white. My hands developed the tremor that came from decades of exposure to industrial chemicals. My vision began to fail in ways that made detailed work increasingly difficult. I was becoming obsolete, a piece of biological machinery wearing out and destined to be replaced. The end came not dramatically, but with bureaucratic efficiency. A medical evaluation determined that my productivity had declined below acceptable thresholds, and that the cost of maintaining me in working condition exceeded the value of my continued labor. I was scheduled for termination, a process that would be quick, painless, and economically optimal for the facility's operational requirements. They gave me 3 days to complete my final work assignments, ensuring that the transition to my replacement would be smooth and that no productivity would be lost during the changeover. I spent those days performing the same tasks I had performed for years, maintaining the same equipment, following the same protocols, as if nothing had changed except the arbitrary deadline that now defined the limits of my existence. On the final day, I was escorted to a processing facility where other obsolete workers waited for their turn at termination. We sat in rows like products on a conveyor belt, each tagged with identification numbers and processing codes to ensure accurate record keeping during our disposal. The room was quiet, except for the soft humming of machinery and the occasional shuffle of feet as someone was called forward. When my number was announced, I stood and walked to the designated station without hesitation or fear. The technician who would perform the procedure was efficient and professional, checking my identification tags and verifying the termination authorization before preparing the injection that would stop my heart. She worked with the casual competence of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times before. "Any final statements for the record?" she asked, more from habit than genuine interest in my response. I told her that I had been dead for 11 years, 7 months, and 22 days, and that I was grateful they were finally allowing my body to catch up with the rest of me. She noted my response in her logbook and administered the injection. The chemical cocktail entered my bloodstream and began shutting down my vital systems with the same efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of my time in Imperial custody. My vision dimmed, my breathing became shallow, and my consciousness began to fade like a light being slowly extinguished. In those final moments, as my brain ceased its futile attempts to process sensory information, I experienced something that might have been peace. The constant vigilance that had defined my existence for over a decade finally relaxed. The endless calculation of survival strategies became irrelevant, and the crushing weight of institutional compliance lifted from shoulders that would soon be still forever. The last thought that crossed my dying mind was not regret, anger, or fear, but a simple observation. The Imperium had achieved its goal with perfect efficiency. The man who had once believed in justice and spoken against corruption was completely gone, replaced by something that had served Imperial interests faithfully until its usefulness expired. The system had worked exactly as designed, transforming a problem into a resource, and then disposing of that resource when it was no longer needed. My death was recorded in the facility's operational logs as routine maintenance, no more significant than the replacement of a worn-out filter or the disposal of contaminated waste. The body that had housed 11 years of suffering was processed through the facility's organic recycling systems, its constituent nutrients eventually becoming fertilizer for the algae farms, where other modified workers would continue the endless cycle of production and consumption. Prison in the 41st millennium is not punishment but transformation, not correction but consumption. It takes human beings and converts them into something more useful and less troublesome, grinding away everything that makes life meaningful until only function remains. The process is efficient, cost-effective, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. There is no redemption in this system because redemption implies the possibility of return to a previous state, and the modifications inflicted upon prisoners are irreversible by design. There is no justice because justice requires the consideration of right and wrong, and institutional efficiency recognizes no moral categories beyond productive and counterproductive. There is no hope because hope depends on the belief that conditions might improve. The only change prisoners can expect is the gradual decay that leads from slavery to death. The guards, administrators, and researchers who operate these facilities are not monsters. Though they perform monstrous tasks, they are servants of a system that has calculated the most efficient methods for converting human problems into human resources. And they execute their duties with the same professional competence that characterizes all imperial bureaucracy. Evil in this context is not a matter of individual malice, but institutional logic carried to its inevitable conclusion. Those who enter imperial prisons leave behind everything that made them human, except the basic biological functions harnessed for productive labor. Their minds are stripped of independence, their bodies modified for optimal performance, and their spirits crushed so completely that the concept of resistance becomes literally unthinkable. They become perfect prisoners, completely compliant, totally predictable, and utterly disposable. This is the reality of justice in the Imperium of Man, a system that has abandoned the pretense of rehabilitation in favor of simple resource extraction. Prisoners are raw material to be processed, not citizens to be corrected, and their fate is determined not by the nature of their crimes, but by the efficiency requirements of institutional operation. The man I had been before my arrest would not recognize the thing I became. And perhaps that represents a form of mercy. The complete erasure of identity eliminates the suffering that would come from remembering what was lost. The perfect prisoner feels no grief for his destroyed humanity because he has forgotten that humanity ever existed. In the end, imperial justice achieves its goals with absolute efficiency. The elimination of threats to social stability through the complete transformation of threatening individuals into useful resources. The process is brutal but thorough, cost-effective but comprehensive, and it serves the Imperium's needs perfectly while destroying everything that might have made those needs questionable. This is what prison means in the 41st millennium. Not a place of punishment or rehabilitation, but a factory that takes broken people and breaks them more thoroughly until they become exactly what the system needs them to be. And when they are no longer useful, even in their broken state, they are discarded with the same efficiency that characterized their transformation. There is no escape from this system because it does not simply confine the body, but reconstructs the mind. There is no resistance because resistance requires a sense of self that the process systematically destroys. There is no hope because hope depends on possibilities that the system is designed to eliminate. The only truth left at the end is the truth I discovered in my final moments. That death, when it finally comes, represents not defeat, but completion. The system achieves its perfect victory not when prisoners are killed, but when they become so thoroughly modified that killing them is unnecessary. My death was simply the final step in a process that had been completed years earlier. The disposal of waste that had served its purpose,